Bonjour ou rebonjour en tout cas. Nous sommes réunis ici dans ce panel pour aborder la question la plus importante de notre époque, sans doute celle aussi des temps futurs, une question qui devrait être la priorité aussi des politiques. La question de l'urgence climatique et la nécessité d'affronter et de se confronter aux effets, à la trajectoire du changement climatique, mais aussi à ses causes et aux réponses qui sont apportées jusqu'ici. Alors, on se rend compte que c'est une question complexe qui implique autant des données scientifiques, géophysiques, que des processus politiques, économiques, sociaux, socioculturels, des réflexions philosophiques aussi, certainement. C'est pourquoi cette question, on peut se demander dans quelle mesure, lorsqu'elle est abordée justement dans les médias, elle est abordée comme une priorité. Est-elle abordée comme une priorité dans nos pays européens? On peut poser la question autrement, si vous voulez. Le traitement éditorial d'ensemble que les hiérarchies des médias réservent à la question du changement climatique est-il à la hauteur de l'immensité de ce défi? Et de façon liée, les pratiques journalistiques individuelles, à un niveau plus micro donc, sont-elles à la hauteur? Alors, on le sait, les journalistes qui traitent ces questions sont très souvent critiqués, les journalistes en général, mais ceux-là le sont sans doute encore plus que d'autres. Souvent, on leur reproche d'être trop alarmistes et tantôt exactement l'inverse, d'être trop optimistes, de sous-estimer finalement l'ampleur des changements en cours. On leur reproche parfois aussi d'être des militants verts ou d'être trop conciliants avec le système économique. Ces préoccupations, ces critiques, finalement, qu'elles soient fondées ou non, autour du métier, il y a un collectif de journalistes français qui les a pris en charge récemment en rédigeant un texte assez fondamental, une charte. Une charte pour un journalisme à la hauteur de l'urgence climatique. Il en a été brièvement question ce matin, Hugues Dorzé l'a abordé. Cette charte, elle est sortie en septembre 2022 et depuis lors, elle a réuni déjà plus de 1500 signatures. Je crois que les chiffres doivent même être déjà largement au-delà. Ce qui est le signe d'une vraie préoccupation. Cette charte énumère une quinzaine de recommandations ou d'engagements à prendre en vue de modifier les façons de travailler et de mieux intégrer l'enjeu climatique dans l'élaboration de l'information qui est faite avant tout, il faut le rappeler, à destination des publics. Et en la matière, l'information des publics sur le changement climatique, sur les réponses à y apporter, sur les comportements à changer, sur les politiques structurelles à changer, sont de première importance. Alors, que faut-il changer? Que doit-on améliorer? À quelles conditions? Qu'est-ce qui se fait déjà? Quelles initiatives existent en Europe? Quels obstacles, éventuellement, freins ou limites ces initiatives rencontrent-elles? C'est le propos de ce panel que de tenter de répondre à ces questions avec nos trois invités. Chacune et chacun d'entre eux est fortement engagé justement dans des initiatives innovantes en matière de journalisme ou de formation au journalisme et dans des réseaux collaboratifs. Réseau collaboratif qui regroupe donc des journalistes engagés pour le climat. Ils vont nous en parler. J'ai le plaisir justement de vous les présenter. Alors, je vais commencer par Milou DIRKX, ici à ma droite, qui coordonne le réseau de journalisme Clean Energy Wire, qui vise justement à promouvoir et à faire circuler des contacts, des ressources, des expertises et des lieux d'expertise pour les journalistes qui traitent la transition énergétique. Et donc il s'agit pour elle et pour ce réseau finalement de renforcer la coopération autour d'un journalisme de qualité par-delà les frontières. À sa droite, Lorenz MATZAT, qui est cofondateur des réseaux allemands et suisses des journalistes engagés pour le climat. Il est aussi professeur invité à l'université de Leipzig et il travaille depuis autour de 2020, je crois, dans le réseau Arena Network, qui regroupe des journalistes et des chercheurs. Donc, ils travaillent sur des sujets liés au climat afin justement de faciliter les échanges je dirais, d'informations, aussi de bonnes pratiques entre les journalistes qui travaillent sur les questions climatiques, aussi que ce soit au niveau local, national ou européen. Et enfin, Lisa URLBAUER, qui est coordinatrice de la formation au journalisme constructif au Bonn Institute, qui l'est depuis peu de temps. Elle viendra nous faire part justement de son expérience. Alors le journalisme constructif, il en a été question ce matin dans un panel spécifique où des propos vraiment très, très intéressants se sont échangés. Et je crois qu'on verra avec elle comment ce journalisme constructif peut se lier et apporter quelque chose justement au journalisme sur le climat. Alors on va respecter l'ordre finalement qui se trouve ici. Je vais laisser donc un peu de temps à chacun de nos invités pour présenter d'abord finalement son lieu de travail, son propos. Et puis nous passerons à l'une ou l'autre question pour échanger et la parole vous sera bien évidemment donnée pour poursuivre le débat. Merci, Milou DIRKX.
Thank you so much. And now I will switch to English. And I have to admit today I kind of regret that I dropped French in high school. Even though I have a French name, which I know is the dog of Tintin, so you can make jokes about that after the panel. I will explain to you a little bit more about Clean Energy Wire. Clean Energy Wire is a news organization based in Berlin. It was founded in 2014, and the aim is to support journalists on a global scale with their climate and energy reporting. And I think the best way to understand Clean Energy Wire is that we sort of exist of three different entities. First, there is the editorial offer that we have, so our newsroom. And that's also what Clean Energy Wire started with in 2014, which was around the time that Germany still had one of the most ambitious climate targets in the world. And they were in the midst of starting their energy transition. And an energy transition is really huge. It means that everything will change from the way we move ourselves, from the way we eat, where we heat our homes, and the way we eat. So it was started in 2014 to really explain this, to look into what our government's promising, but also to produce this information in English. And right now we have 4 journalists working for us who write about recent developments, but they also write really in-depth dossiers and fact sheets. Which I think they are all really useful tools for journalists. So if you really want to, for instance, know how the European emission trade system works, we will have a fact sheet about that. And it's sort of a running gag in our organization that when someone asks a question in general, we would have a fact sheet explaining it. So we have this editorial offer. Next to that, we have a media programs team. And with the media programs, we organize both events and opportunities for journalists who cover climate and energy. And what type of events am I talking about? We are organizing conferences. We organize online briefings, also a lot of briefings about EU climate and energy policy. We organize grants, cross-border grants for journalists. And finally, we organize research tours. So we recently took a group of 18 journalists to Germany, France and Switzerland to talk about the different approaches of these countries to nuclear power. And we will actually soon be in Brussels, our team as well, to do a research tour about the EU and how the EU is planning on balancing climate action together with the energy crisis that's going on. And then finally, my favorite part of our organization is our network. It now consists of over 300 journalists worldwide who all cover the topic of energy and climate. And they are from 78 different countries. And we have both ambassadors and members in our network. Ambassadors are all more established journalists that we are in close contact with that help us be sort of like more regional knowledge hubs in different parts of the world. Because I am not an expert about Indian climate policy, but luckily we have two ambassadors in India who help us with that. Just to give you an example of like the type of things that we organize, recently, as I think most people in this room are aware of, there was COP27. So what we did is we set up an online briefing with experienced COP reporters. We also set up a Signal group where we had 58 journalists who were all covering the COP and who could support each other, and most of them were actually also in Egypt. And finally, we set up a online briefing for journalists from the Global South to explain some of the EU priorities at COP27. And obviously they had a lot of questions also about climate finance. And we were there with someone from the European Commission and two experienced EU reporters. Next to that, we offer journalists direct support, so they can always contact us with any type of questions. And I think one of the main strengths of Clean Energy Wire is that we are not necessarily saying we are the ones who have all the answers, but we hope we can connect you with someone who does have the answers. And that is also really the strength of the network, is that journalists can always contact each other if they have questions, if they don't understand something, if they cannot find relevant information because they, for instance, don't speak the language. So we see ourselves as guides in a maze of climate information. I think another strong suit of Clean Energy Wire is that we're very oriented on the energy story and therefore also the solution story to the climate crisis. I think in this last year, energy got picked up a lot as a topic due to the war, the invasion of Russia in Ukraine. And I know there's a lot of other really great climate networks out there who focus, for instance, more on environment or climate. And in the end, all these topics are intertwined. But our starting point really is the energy transition in Germany and Europe. And finally, I think a strength of Clean Energy Wire is that there's actually a person on the other end. And we sometimes still get like surprise reactions if someone emails us or calls us, that they do get a personalized, tailor-made answer to their question. But that's something that we pride ourselves in and that we find really important. So then I think I will close this short introduction into Clean Energy Wire with what I think is needed for the future of climate and energy journalism. I think what is needed is a cross-border and collaborative mindset, because this story doesn't end at borders, and there is numerous examples of that. And if journalists collaborate with one another, if they support one another, they can actually write better informed stories. I myself am from the Netherlands, and I am often annoyed with how much of a Dutch silo you would read the news in, whereas that news is often really relevant and can be better understood with an international angle. And I think the second thing that's really needed is that there is a good translation of this topic to different audiences by different beats, because in my opinion, every reporter is and should be a climate reporter, because whether you write about entertainment or whether you cover sports or fashion or I don't know which beat, they all have to do with the climate, the energy and the environmental story. And I think it's really, really needed that we treat it that way. But I'm pretty sure that we'll also discuss that further in this session. So I will leave it at that for now.
Merci, merci beaucoup Milou. Je voulais justement te poser une question supplémentaire à propos. Sorry, I just wanted to complete for you. Voilà, une question donc en plus. Est-ce que oui, pourquoi est-ce si important ce service finalement, ce service qui est offert aux journalistes allemands, mais aussi de 78 pays? Est-ce que dans votre expérience quotidienne, vous notez des besoins particuliers, des journalistes qui sont vraiment, je dirais, perdus ou qui ont des problèmes de compréhension de certains aspects de cette problématique qui, on le dit souvent, est technique en matière d'énergie en particulier, et en matière de politique énergétique aussi. Mais vous pourriez nous donner peut-être quelques exemples concrets, surtout des difficultés que peuvent rencontrer les journalistes?
Yeah, so first maybe an example of a question that we got a lot in this last year was a lot of questions about nuclear power. A lot of international journalists who simply couldn't believe that Germany was planning on phasing out nuclear power amid an energy crisis, and now they have postponed it to April next year. And because of the current energy crisis, a lot of countries are now looking into the option of nuclear. And I think one of the things that makes writing as a journalist about energy transition really tricky is that a lot of these projects take a lot of time. If you start now, if you were to have political consensus, which is already really hard to get, to build a new nuclear power plant, it would take at least 15 years before anything would happen with that plant. And I think that is, for instance, a really good example. We also got a lot of questions from, for instance, Southeast Asian countries about this topic, about what was Germany's reaction, energy reaction to the war in Ukraine. And I think we are well equipped to then explain that to them. I think another good example, I got a question from a Dutch journalist, which was at the end of last year, and she asked me, is Germany aware that the Netherlands wants to scale down on gas? And my answer to that was like, yes, they have been rebuilding their grid since 2015. And this is not to make, like, to poke fun at her, but it is really complicated to understand those stories. And that's sort of what I meant with that this topic really doesn't stop at borders. And we have to look at the European grid and how energy is stored, how it is transported. And those are all international stories that are really hard to understand because, we live in a union with many different languages and understanding of the topic.
Merci beaucoup. Alors on va aborder un autre réseau, another network, avec Lorenz. Lorenz, à toi.
Okay, thank you for inviting me. I have a presentation. Could you please put on the slides? Okay, I start already. Well, yeah, my name is Lorenz MATZAT. I'm living in Zurich right now in Switzerland. I'm originally from Berlin, and I decided about 2 years ago to go into the climate beat in a way. Before that, I worked mainly in data journalism and algorithmic accountability reporting. I have a background in political science. I was a newsroom reporter, so and did already a lot of teaching and training in journalism, and now I'm more as kind of an infrastructure worker, I would call myself, meaning I'm helping people to set up organizations. That's what I'm doing right now. So I'm an organizer or developing organizations or help people to do this. So the slides are not coming up. I try to do it without it. It's no problem. As already have been mentioned before, we have several networks which went up last year and this year, and here we are. Okay, thank you. Maybe can you just put on the next slide, please? So I try to collect every networks which there are already in Europe. As we heard before, the one in 2017 from Clean Energy Wire was set up in 2017. We have the ARENA network, which I'm part of since this autumn. I'm working for ARENA for journalism. And last year we saw 2 networks going up, one in Austria in April. The German followed in June, and we have one in Switzerland which came up this, I think it was April or May, something like that. Just put this slide up to give you an idea that there's something in the kind we see more and more of this. When we founded the ones in Germany, and I was involved in the Swiss too, we now get contacts from other countries. Like there are people in the Netherlands talking about this. As far as we know, we have the French charter. I'm coming to this in a moment. So the question, I think, or what's interesting about this, why is there a need for these networks? Because there are a lot of journalistic organizations already, right? So why are people thinking we need climate journalism as a special topic? Why can't the old or the existing organizations not provide this? And I think in a way this displays why climate journalism is, and we have to imagine the climate crisis, we know about it for 50 years now, right? The Club of Rome report was in 72, 50 years ago. So why did it take more or less nearly 50 years that journalism has thought about, oh, probably we should cover climate more, right? It's in a way part of the problem of all the societies that the climate crisis is not taken serious enough. I think this summer probably was very important, and of course in a sad way the war in Ukraine forcing people to think about energy and to reduce the waste is in a way, yeah, 22 is probably a special date. Please, the next slide. These are from the both charters. From the one is on the left is from the German one and Austrian one, and the right is an excerpt from the French. And I think what both share is the idea of trying to strengthen the thought that the climate beat is not a topic like another topic like I don't know, theater or so. It's about that it's in dimension. I think this is what most people who go into climate journalism try to live in their newsrooms, or try to transport the idea that climate is related to more or less everything humans do, in a way that we consume everywhere energy, that we produce waste. So, and this has always an effect on climate, right? So, and journalism is more or less about everything humans do, and sometimes animals, and sometimes the environment itself. So climate journalism has to be part of every journalistic beat in the future. This means, again, and please, next slide, we need competences most, let's say, older journalists don't have, or they have. How do they integrate this approach? If we say climate is a dimension and has to be part of every beat in journalism, how do they get this into their methods, into their approaches? They often work for 10, 20 or 30 years already in journalism, and for often I think it's hard to change when you're long in a profession how to tackle things. And Marc already mentioned the criticism on people doing climate journalism, especially in Germany, or this is what I know about most, is that it's activism, that if you try to be or to bring climate into your reporting, that you are an activist, and you should be in a way neutral or objective about this, which is very hard, I think, to be objective about climate change, because it's not an opinion or something. It's happening. So this is in a way a very strange debate, I think. And most people covering economy, for example, don't think of themselves as activists, I would say, but normally they are people who say the market economy, the capitalistic market economy, is the best thing we ever had. So they never, and nobody would say this is activism what they're doing. And so it's an interesting discussion. We probably talk about this later. The list I put up on the slide is about, and I think this is a little bit different to what Clean Energy Wire does. It's more, in a way, it's a DIY or self-helping groups. This networks, at least in Germany and Switzerland and in Austria. So it's more about people trying to find like-minded people, because often they're the younger people in the newsrooms. I think the German network consists now out of maybe 800 to 900 people who are loosely connected about over a newsletter. We have a Slack channel or a Slack group where about 300 to 400 people are involved, and we meet monthly via Zoom and have exchanges. We have experts coming in. on different topics. And after that, we all often have like exchanges where people just can talk about what's hard for them or where their problems lies. And this is very important for many of them because they're often alone in the newsrooms still. So they often hear, as I said, you're an activist. Don't be so alarmistic about climate change. And so for them it's very important to meet other people who are doing the same stuff and getting inspired and just be able to be honest about what's not going well at their work. So at this stage, as I said, these networks are more like self-helping groups. This shouldn't sound disrespectful. What we see in all three is that the German one, the Austrian one, and the Swiss one, that they're getting in this phase where they come from a kind of people do it in their free time, and now we see people coming in and trying to raise money to be more professional to get this on the next level. This is where we are at right now. Next slide, please. Yeah, I put a list on this website. You find the URL there, where you find the links to all these websites. You find my email address there. If you're interested in starting a network in your country, get in touch. Last information from my side, Arena for Journalism is planning to put up a yearly conference on climate journalism on a European level. The first edition is coming up next year. If you want to know more about it, get in touch. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Lorenz. Nous reviendrons effectivement un peu plus tard sur les questions qui ont été abordées, esquissées d'ores et déjà. Donc, merci pour finalement ce lancement et pour tout l'intérêt effectivement que représentent je pense, ces réseaux pour des journalistes. C'est important, qui sont encore effectivement souvent, la plupart du temps, souvent seuls, sauf peut-être dans des journaux comme le Guardian où ils sont un peu plus nombreux. Maintenant, nous allons laisser la parole à Lisa URLBAUER pour qu'elle nous parle de son expérience au Bonn Institute. Merci beaucoup, Lisa. Et je crois qu'il y a semble-t-il, il y a des slides aussi pour l'équipe. Merci.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for having me. We also, even though we're called the Bonn Institute, we also consider ourselves a network organization. And I will start by telling you a little bit about the Bonn Institute and my work. The Bonn Institute for Journalism and Constructive Dialogue is a fairly newly founded nonprofit organization based in Germany. We publicly launched our work in March, so it's not even been a year that we are working on constructive journalism, and we are dedicated to spreading the practice and the ideas of constructive journalism among newsrooms and journalists, mainly in Germany, but also beyond that, beyond the borders. And we do that by doing trainings with newsrooms and journalists and helping them to develop formats, to have a more constructive reporting, but we also publish papers and our new findings on how constructive journalism is working. Next slide, please. So yeah, that's me. I'm the journalism training coordinator, so I'm involved in creating the curriculum and workshops that we are offering for the newsrooms. And yeah, I'm a trained journalist. I worked for a daily newspaper, so I'm a print and online journalist. And we also have in our network journalists who come from different media. So we also think it's very important to have like different expertise coming together. So we're a fairly small organization, we're 9 people, but we also have a network of experts from the media, journalism and media sphere who are coming from different beats of journalism. Next slide, please. I want to start by telling you a little bit more about what constructive journalism is. I don't know, anyone who was at the panel on constructive journalism this morning here in the audience? A few. So you'll get a bit of a recap. The Constructive Institute, who I saw was also on the panel this morning, they are one of our 4 partners, because we at the Bonn Institute we have 4 partners. It's basically a public-private partnership between 3 German media outlets and the Constructive Institute in Aarhus. And so which also means that we kind of support the same idea of constructive journalism. And constructive journalism consists of 3 basic elements, and that is the focus on solutions, also called solutions journalism. It means that we incorporate multiple perspectives in our reporting and that we aim to foster constructive dialogue. Solutions journalism is rigorous reporting about responses to social problems. So climate change is a huge problem we are facing as a global society. And we as journalists need to cover what's working in order to address that problem. So I feel like I'm sitting at a very nice panel here because I feel like our work is actually complementary to each other, because we all want to report on the issues we have with climate change and the different branches of society that were mentioned, from housing to energy to our food, transportation. But we cannot stop at just pointing out that we have problems, because we also need to find ways to fix these problems. And journalists who are doing constructive journalism are reporting about these responses. So it's not about us writing editorials saying this would be the best solution. We are not activists, we are journalists. Constructive journalism is about widening your lens in your investigations and reporting on what's working to address these issues, to look at evidence that shows this is an idea that is actually reducing CO2 emissions, for example, but also pointing out the limitations that certain ideas have. So that is the first element of constructive journalism, the focus on solutions. The second element is what we call multiple perspective. So that means that we need to widen our lens as journalists in reporting, that we show nuance and complexity, that we show not only the black and white, but there, especially in climate coverages, there are many shades of gray in coverage and writing about issues. So we really stress that it's important to point these nuances out. But also we see this element of multiple perspectives on a more structural level, because we as journalists also need to reflect on our own biases that we have, because we're humans and objectivity doesn't exist. We are not neutral observers. So for us, it's really important to learn about that as journalists and to actively kind of work that we don't fall into these traps of having biases. And lastly, constructive journalism means fostering dialogues and creating rooms where we can engage as a community and talk about how we want to move forward. Because climate change forces us to really think about the future and kind of negotiate as a society, as a global society, on how we want to deal with that. And for example, the COP27 is an example of a room where a global community comes together with all its pitfalls and limitations, but also we as journalists need to find these rooms and create these spaces, for example, in our local communities or on state level or on national level, to really talk and negotiate about the future and how we want to deal with these issues, especially when we want to reach a certain amount of climate justice. So we really need to give room, like make space at the table for people who are not heard yet. or not heard enough. And so for us, these three elements belong together. That's why we, kind of see them as like interconnected circles, because one element influences the other, and then you can start from the beginning when you created a table, room for discussion, then you can talk about new solutions, and then you need to make sure that all the perspectives are heard. And yeah, now I'd like to continue. We can stay on this slide, so no further, but I kind of want to, kind of bridge the gap further, how constructive journalism relates to climate coverage. So I don't know if you know if any of you have heard of the Reuters Digital News Report, probably, and the Reuters Digital News Report points out year after year that a growing number of people actively avoid news. People are really worn out, and we journalists probably are too. You talked about the self-help groups. Journalists and humans are worn out about like hearing about the multiple crises that we are having overlaying each other: climate, the pandemic, the wars. And so people feel like they cannot really do something about it, because journalists mainly focus on pointing out the problems and then they stop. But that leads to something that psychologists call learned helplessness. So people feel overwhelmed and think, oh, we cannot do anything about it anyway. And then they tune out because they don't want to be confronted with even more bad news about the world. But it's really important for like an informed society that also needs to make decisions in their daily lives, but also, need to vote and make political decisions. For them, it's really important that they can make informed decisions. So they need to inform themselves about what's going on in the world. And constructive journalism is a way to kind of get people engaged in news again, because constructive reporting really is about putting the needs of, placing the needs people have at the heart of the journalism. And, people need to know what's working in order to reduce emissions. And we need to know the limitations of the different solutions. So it is really important that we, think about that. And we at the Bonn Institute do trainings with journalists, because constructive journalism is not about sugarcoating the problems we have. It's just reporting about other perspectives on these issues. For example, one of the main questions that we ask as constructive journalists is, who is doing it better? So where is a community, a state, a place that is better in solving a problem or mitigating the situation, and then reporting about that. Yeah, next slide, please. So I mentioned earlier that we are fairly young. We've just been around for 9 months, and but moving forward, climate coverage will also be one of our main focus points with our work at the Bonn Institute, and we see a great potential, especially on a local level. And we're very excited because we're getting a lot of requests from newsrooms and journalists who especially want to be trained in constructive climate coverage. And for me, as the journalism trainer, as the coordinator, I'm thinking right now about 2 main questions. They might seem very simplistic, but I feel like they can be like a signpost on how to move forward in training journalists. It's the question of how are communities responding to climate change? So what is happening? And the second question is, how are news outlets covering these responses? And a couple of stories that I heard from people who attended COP27 were that we do not have the commitments on a state level that we need. But we're very inspired by meeting community leaders on a lower level, on a city level or on a state level, who are actually, following the promises they're giving, and they're maybe even more advanced than the states on a whole. So I see a big potential for like local news outlets and journalists on the ground to cover these developments and see what's working. So yeah, thank you.
Merci, merci beaucoup Lisa. Beaucoup de choses abordées et justement pour faire le lien avec ce que tu viens de dire et l'importance des médias locaux. Je voudrais revenir aussi, pour cette question, sur ce que Lorenz nous a dit à propos de la nécessité de sortir le journalisme environnemental de sa niche et de la seule spécialisation des journalistes environnementaux. La question, donc, comment faire pour que d'autres journalistes que les seuls journalistes environnementaux pour qui c'est un engagement, mais aussi une somme de connaissances, d'investissement, à quelles conditions d'autres journalistes pourraient-ils finalement prêter main forte et s'engager dans une voie, disons, un peu plus commune et moins séparée en tout cas. Et est-ce que justement le terrain local est-il à ce niveau-là un terrain privilégié à vos yeux, à tous? Alors je ne sais pas qui veut commencer à répondre comme vous voulez. Lorenz,
okay.
Merci.
Thank you for the question. Well, I wouldn't say a priority, but an important part of it. We have I forgot to mention one network we have got in Germany also. It's from Climatique, which is a newsroom modeled a little bit after ProPublica in the US. And they have a huge local journalist network. I think over 2,000 local journalists are in there, if I'm not wrong. And they cover different topics, but one is climate, and what they are doing is they provide data sets, for example, on water. Who's using water? Most of the people in Germany don't know that the industry in Germany normally doesn't pay for water. They don't have to pay at all for if they use water. Private people have to pay, industry doesn't. And of course, this summer we saw, I think, especially in France, but in other countries in Europe too, that how important water is for everything, of course, for us humans directly, but for industry, especially energy, like nuclear power plants need water normally to be cooled. So these are directly connected to daily life of people, I think, and this is always working when stories are relatable, that people can relate it to their own life, and climate is directly related to everyone's life. So I think there's a huge potential that we use the local news or on the local news level to transport the idea that our life is going to change very rapidly in the next decades, and that we need solutions to adapt, of course, not only to adapt, we have to try to fight the climate change, but adaptation will be, I think, one of the most important beats in the way in the next 20 years. So if you learning journalism, specialize in that, I think you will have work.
Can I follow up on that?
Oui, bien sûr. Yeah,
so yeah, we're actually working with Correctiv, this German nonprofit, on a project together for next spring, and one of the local public broadcasters from the south, and we're planning to travel to the Ahr Valley, which is in western Germany, that was heavily flooded in the summer of 2021, and we want to create on one hand, we want to create a dialogue between the citizens living there and how they've adapted and reacted to the situation after many of them lost their livelihoods. And we also want to look at where there are different projects that, for example, have adapted how they are growing the wineries, and what they're doing with, like, how people have maybe moved further away because they need to adapt and secure them. So we're, for example, planning to see what has happened to make journalists aware of the impact of extreme weather situations, but also look at how people are dealing with that and what's working. So that would be an example of where we're bringing local journalists in to see the problems, but also get to know people who are involved in working at what now, how are we dealing with that. Yeah.
Oui, merci. Milou, sur cette question ou pas nécessairement, mais je crois que ça peut être aussi comment dire, c'est cette préoccupation pour ce que les populations vivent au niveau local des effets, des traductions du changement climatique. C'est peut-être aussi la meilleure façon finalement de faire connaître ce qui se fait ou ce qui ne se fait pas au niveau européen, par exemple, puisque vous êtes toutes et tous attachés à la coopération transfrontalière. Vous avez dit que l'environnement est un sujet et c'est évident, qui dépasse les frontières et qui est pris en charge alors insuffisamment, notamment au niveau de la Commission européenne. On a dit ce matin aussi dans un autre panel que les affaires européennes, ça n'intéresse pas beaucoup les populations, les citoyens qui trouvent ça ennuyeux. Est-ce que justement ce type de préoccupation-là, ce type d'enquête qui se ferait davantage sur le terrain local, c'est pas une manière aussi de reconnecter le local et le plus global, comme on dit? Est-ce que des journalistes européens ne pourraient pas prendre finalement ça aussi au vol? Et ce ne serait pas une manière d'établir justement des coopérations entre journalistes environnementaux, économiques et journalistes européens, parfois à l'intérieur d'une même rédaction?
I can start off with this question. I think you made some really interesting points, and maybe to just sort of back up a little bit before you go to the future. I think what you saw for a really long time that the topic of energy would always fall under the finance business desk, whereas climate would fall under the science desk. And I think we've really seen a huge growth in even like the past 5 years of climate change becoming a more mainstream topic in many newsrooms, and I think you can see that by that there is more climate reporters coming, more climate desks, more specialized outlets, but also networks like the reason that all three of us are sitting here. And that is sort of like more of this new model. And I think in an ideal model, what you would have is have a newsroom where there is, as I think both also Lorenz also said, this realization that climate is a topic that touches upon all other topics. So as I said before, like everyone should be and could be a climate journalist. And it's often, when COVID started, a lot of people used that as an argument to say, see, this is how you should report on a crisis. The hospital numbers are always like on the front page of a newspaper. Maybe you should do the same with greenhouse gas emissions. So that's the way that you could report on it. And actually, I think what would be a better comparison is the way that we cover economics and business at the moment, because every self-respecting newspaper or broadcaster has journalists working for them who cover economics. And you also see it doesn't matter like which topic you cover, whether that's sports or health or others, you would also cover the financial aspects of those sectors. I know of an example of AFP who have a hub of economic and climate reporters who together then report on topics like agriculture, energy, transport. So I think that, for instance, is a really good example of how journalists in one newsroom are collaborating. And I remember another Austrian example, and I don't exactly remember the name of the broadcaster, but so it is happening. And to me, I think that is the way for the future to really understand this topic in all of its aspects, as it is extremely broad.
And maybe,
oui, Lisa, oui.
Maybe to follow up on this question of like can you still hear me? Okay, it sounds.
It's okay.
Okay, on this like cross-border collaboration, I think that's where you were also asking about that. I feel like especially a kind of constructive journalism focus shows its strength there, because on one hand, like you said, climate doesn't stop at the borders, so we really need to think about how we are all interconnected. And sometimes, I mean, it's often currently being used as an excuse not to do anything about it, because like, why should Germany do more when others aren't? But at the same time, it can help us as journalists, if we have like an international network being connected, to also hold our own governments on a local level, because, you know, in Germany we have a strong federal state, so we also have, you know, strong state governments making decisions about climate neutrality, for example, and energy. But we can hold our governments accountable when we can point out where people are doing it better, where it's actually maybe I'm originally from northern Germany, so like the Dutch border actually isn't that far. So, and maybe you find a community that's just across the border, maybe not that far away from your own community, and you can see that they are doing better in, for example, having a green energy grid. So, and by pointing that out, you also make it more relevant to your community, because it's not that interesting to learn about other people's problems, especially when you have them too, but to learn about other people's solutions can be very inspiring, and seeing, okay, there are ways to do it, and then you take away the excuse of saying, oh, we can't do anything about it, if you can point out how it's working somewhere else.
And maybe to follow up on your follow-up. I think, because you made a really good point about holding politicians accountable for their promises, and I know of at least 2 examples, both in the Netherlands and the UK, of journalists writing for tabloids in general who make really like a bit like rowdy clickbait type of articles, but who've gone into this climate beat and are now going to politicians saying, look, this is what you promised and you're not keeping your promises. And I think that is, for instance, also a really good example of how this topic is really widening, but also that it's needed. You need, I mean, sometimes internally at Clean Energy Wire or with other journalists, I have discussions like, what type of journalism do we need about climate and energy? You know, do you need like human stories, or is it more explanatory journalism or constructive journalism that Lisa talked about? And my answer would be, you need all of that, because you need to reach different audiences with different types of stories. And I also really think that constructive journalism should play a really important role in that. So.
Merci beaucoup à vous trois. Je crois que c'est l'heure de passer aux questions de la salle. Alors, oui, il y a une question juste là-bas au bord de la rangée mi-auditoire à peu près. Et,
oui, bonjour. Je m'appelle Anne-Henri, je suis journaliste à Lille et je représente aussi un réseau de journalistes français qui sont spécialisés dans l'écologie et la nature, les JNE. Donc je suis ravie de découvrir d'autres réseaux internationaux. Nous, notre problème, c'est qu'on a été créé il y a 50 ans et aujourd'hui, on n'arrive plus à recruter des journalistes dans notre réseau. Donc ma première question, c'est comment rendre ces réseaux attractifs? Et la deuxième, c'est que je suis basée à Lille et ce réseau est très parisien. Et j'ai eu envie de créer un réseau annexe à Lille, qui est quand même une ville de plus d'1 million d'habitants. Et je n'ai pas réussi à mobiliser les journalistes autour du projet des JNE. Je n'ai pas réussi à trouver des journalistes passionnés par l'environnement, qui avaient envie de prendre du temps pour partager de l'information, mener des enquêtes, parce que nous, dans le Nord, on est concernés par le nucléaire, par les pollutions industrielles, par les migrations climatiques. Donc je voulais connaître vos recettes pour développer ce genre de réseaux locaux.
Merci. Peut-être l'une ou l'autre réponse à cette question. Est-ce qu'il y a des recettes, des bonnes pratiques inspirantes?
I start probably, right?
Okay.
Okay. I think it's a kind of branding issue in the sense that environmental journalism, of course, exists for a long time. We have the same in Germany. We have a lot of but it, in a way, got a little bit out of style. I think it's a kind of question of generations too. So climate is the term of the hour, in a way. For example, we thought of calling our network a Journalist for Future first. This was an idea which came up. We got bad feedback on that, and I'm lucky we didn't, but of course it's too close to Fridays for Future, and actually maybe too activistic, but and we have them in the room, so they can talk for themselves probably, but the younger generation, the millennials or the people who are around 20, 25 right now, I think they grew up with the term climate. So that would be my first advice. Call yourself or set up a group with something climate in the title, and try to recruit young people who are probably nearer to the questions of people who are going into the industry and into the news industry, and try to tip into their networks they already have, because I think, as I look at me, I'm nearly 50, so I'm a kind of wired differently than the journalists. I'm the young journalist or the student journalists I'm teaching. They really, as far as I can see, operate in a different way. How they communicate, how they gather information, how they're interconnected. I think for them it's totally normal to be in messenger services, using Instagram, TikTok and stuff, for example, which is too fast for me. I'm more a Twitter guy, for example, and so on. So you think, first of all, you need, or secondly, you need people from another generation. My guess is that you are all the same age, or most of them coming from the 80s or 90s or something. So that would be my short answer.
Merci.
Maybe, to follow up on what Lorenz said, which I agree with, I think at Clean Energy Wire, for us, it's really about quality and less about quantity. So you can have a huge network of very non-active, non-interested members, but that won't get you anywhere. Whereas if you have a smaller network, that's, first of all, easier to manage, but with engaged members who actually want to meet and who want to collaborate and who have that sort of more collaborative mindset, I think that is really helpful. And the other thing that you can, of course, do is, I don't know that much about the media landscape in Lille specifically, but I can imagine that maybe there are other networks around other topics and that you would link them together. So, for instance, today I was in a panel where there was someone working with more of like a migration topic and others were more working on a climate topic, but these are topics that very well could go together. So that could be a way of also finding new people instead of like those people who already identify themselves as climate journalists.
Hi, so my name is Ines. Thank you so much for educating us via this panel. So as I don't know how to pronounce your name, so I will say as Miss Lisa. I don't know if it's, sorry, okay. So as you said, it's people, especially young people, feel overwhelmed about the climate change, and we feel sometimes that fear about the future, how the future will evolve, since we don't know about how the climate crisis will evolve as well with us, especially young people, because if it's the Generation Z, I think it's more for us the future about climate change. So you didn't talk about it, but because you said about we feel overwhelmed, especially young people, it reminded me that topic we don't talk about that much, but I've learned and I try to educate myself, and so that's why I asked it here. Do you know some resources about climate anxiety? Because I try, but it's so hard, and since English is not my first language, it's even harder to find resources in French, so I try to learn about it, but it's just so hard because, like, not a lot of specialists or just scientific people, journalists, just no one talks about it, and it's so hard. Like, I found some resources online, but it's not that much, and people who feel anxious, and I think we need to know more about that topic. But if someone can just have some resources, it's just fine. Thank you so much, and sorry for the long question.
No, thank you so much. Yeah, climate anxiety is a very important topic. So in terms of data to know about it, there is a study from the University of Bath in UK, and they conducted a cross-border study, I think among like 10 countries, and this is where they kind of tested for the first time how Gen Z, how young people are feeling about how their governments are responding to climate change, and they overwhelmingly found out that they are not satisfied and that they feel anxious about it. So that is kind of, and there's some German data supporting that too, and also saying that especially young people that's also one of the reasons why young people more disconnect from news, because they feel like journalism is not relevant to their daily life. It's not explaining in like simpler words. Maybe have like introductory. Especially I feel like that also works in climate. Thinking about what are the things that we need to explain over and over again. And maybe I like what the New York Times, for example, is doing. They have like an info box that is attached to all their climate coverage, where they have like 5 article linked that link to like, these are the basic numbers you need to know. This is like a glossary of difficult words, and I feel like that is also something that would help make it, when you understand things more, you are maybe less overwhelmed by it, because at least you start to understand it better. And what we are currently doing at the Bonn Institute is we are working together with psychologists. And we are also working on a series that will be translated in English. That's called, the working title is Psychology for Journalists. And it's about learning, so it's about understanding what I mentioned earlier about the biases and skewed perceptions we have as humans, but also about what journalism is doing to people, by, for example, overwhelming them or making them anxious, which is difficult with the role that journalists have traditionally, that they feel like they always want to, get the bad guys and point things out, but it's on the cost of people's mental health. So these might be 2 things that are helpful to you.
Merci beaucoup. Une autre question?
Hi, I'm Colette Snowden. I'm from Australia, and the reporting on climate change in my country over the past 20 to 30 years has been one of the factors that has limited the policy decisions that have been made. But I want to ask you a practical question about reporting, because it's been evident in the Australian reporting that journalists lack numeracy to be able to explain the science and the data in a way that people really understand. And there's been a huge problem, I think, globally in the insistence on false equivalence in the reporting of information, so that the 99% of science that confirms the effects of global warming is balanced equally by 1% of nonsense. And I just wonder, in your work with journalists, whether you will tackle that and how you will do it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your question. 2-part answer. I think the overlying issue here is that we are having something would never have happened before. There's, in a way, we know what's going to happen in the future. Not exactly when and where, but the science is quite clear what's going to happen in the next decades. It's getting hotter and hotter. We see nowadays more or less the effects of what's from the pollution and so on from 20 years ago. So even if we would stop today with everything, the climate change will go on for decades. So, and journalism isn't made for that. I think this is in a kind of underlying methodology problem. Journalism is always about the future is unclear. So I think this is the big problem for our profession right now, that we have something which is against all of our instincts and we learned about. So, and I think that's what we see in Australia, which was, I think, hit or is going to be hit by the climate crisis much more, for example, than Europe, very fast, or is already. And so in a way we have to change the profession's self-understanding, and how do we try to do this? And what we in a way preach is this idea that climate is not a topic. It's not something you just report about, like the Qatar soccer thing going on. I forgot the name. What is it? World Cup. Yeah, I'm not so interested in soccer. You probably hear that. Yeah, and so to really to bring it and to bring it into the mind that this is a dimension you have to. Yeah, everyone in journalism has to be a climate journalist. And maybe one last sentence about that. What one idea in a way, and people trying to do this is often you have let's say the senior people in the newsrooms, the chief editors and so on, which often are white old men. They don't care much about this topic, and so this is a kind of generational issue again. But we have to go to them and make it so they have to get trainings, because often newsrooms are organized hierarchically, and if the people on the top don't care, it's really hard to get this topic into the newsrooms. So one approach would be very, in a kind of task forcey way, bring the heads of the newsrooms into this topic, make it clear to them you have to learn about it.
If I can then comment on your second question as well, you talked about this sense of false balance. I think this has been heavily criticized in the climate debate, exactly what you said, that if you have one expert talking about climate change, and 97% of climate scientists agree that it's real and it's man-made, you shouldn't put another person in front of them saying, oh no, this is not true. So that has been heavily criticized, and in my experience, at least the things that I read and watch, that has become better. But I do think that this climate denialism is changing, and that's also something as journalists we should really notice and note, because I think what you saw, flat out climate denialism, you won't see it that much anymore. So what you see more is like these tactics being used to delay immediate climate action. So not here, not now, not us, for several reasons. And a really good resource for that is the Cambridge University did a research into this, and they mentioned like the 12 most used arguments to delay climate action. And as a journalist, it's really, really important to acknowledge that as sort of like the new denialism, and to fight that, or like not fight, but like not then have a false balance in that sense of using those arguments.
Maybe just one last follow-up from my side on this, just to stress, when we talk about constructive dialogue as part of the kind of journalism we're doing, it's not about having a false balance, for example, and bringing, deniers with people who see it clearly together, but then, find the room of people who then argue, like who are on the same, like within the spectrum of
believing the climate reality, but then have discussions about how we move this forward. So I just really want to stress that it's not about, for us, constructive dialogue about bringing deniers to the table, but really within the spectrum of the reality, then find discussions on how we have like a just reaction to this and how to move forward.
Merci. Est-il encore d'autres questions? Non, mais de toute façon, je crois qu'on aborde nos 5 dernières minutes, et donc je voulais en profiter pour vous remercier pour vos interventions, pour votre partage d'expérience. Et je crois que ce que vous nous avez montré, justement, c'est que le journalisme environnemental, le journalisme climatique n'est pas qu'une source d'anxiété, d'éco-anxiété. Ce n'est pas qu'une affaire de chiffres, 2 degrés, 3 degrés, plus 2 degrés, plus 3 degrés. Ce n'est pas qu'une affaire non plus de résultats qu'on ne parvient pas à obtenir ou d'objectifs. Ce qui est souvent dans, je dirais, la couverture journalistique traditionnelle, mainstream, que ce n'est pas non plus uniquement je dirais, les mauvaises nouvelles, ou autrement dit les catastrophes qui se produisent. Il ne s'agit évidemment pas de nier l'existence de tout ce dont je viens de parler. Mais ce que vous nous montrez, c'est que, au contraire, le journalisme climatique peut être l'enjeu de processus d'action, de coopération, d'engagement, et vous en êtes les premiers acteurs, en tout cas ici dans ce panel, et je vous en remercie, qui sont éminemment constructifs, et ce sont justement des processus qui s'inscrivent dans la dynamique d'un temps, disons, moyen ou d'un temps long, et pas uniquement dans l'immédiateté de l'événement que constitue l'organisation d'une COP, ou des inondations qui vont durer une semaine au Pakistan et puis qu'on va oublier. Donc pour tout ça, vraiment, du fond du cœur, merci beaucoup, parce que vous faites, je trouve là, vous trois et vos réseaux respectifs dans des domaines tout à fait complémentaires, vous l'avez dit, un boulot remarquable. Alors, vous venez tous les trois d'Allemagne. Je ne sais pas si c'est un hasard de la programmation, mais c'est sans doute lié aussi au fait que l'Allemagne a été peut-être plus en avance, et peut-être au niveau de la société civile aussi, en matière écologique. On sait qu'il y a un puissant courant social, en tout cas qu'il a existé et qu'il est toujours présent en Allemagne. Et donc ça aussi, pour un débat, ou plutôt un symposium des assises qui se déroulent ici à Bruxelles en coopération avec nos partenaires français, c'est une merveilleuse leçon européenne, me semble-t-il, dont on peut s'inspirer, dont toutes les personnes présentes ici, à un moment ou l'autre de leur vie, ne manqueront pas, je pense, de s'inspirer. Alors merci beaucoup encore une fois.